Good morning, class. I hope you're doing well today. Uh, this is the lecture that was scheduled for Wednesday, January 11th, I believe. And so today we're going to cover an important topic. We're going to discuss significant historical earthquakes. Now, this may feel a little bit more like a history class than a technical engineering class, but there's reason to my madness why I have you guys review and understand a little bit about the past. There's a couple of things I really want you guys to understand when it comes to historical earthquakes and earthquakes in general. First, you need to understand that when it comes to earthquakes, we learn empirically. My word, I'm struggling this morning. So earthquakes have been happening for a really long time, but it's only within the last 90 years or so that we've started to really try to understand the science behind earthquakes and how they affect our infrastructure. And with any type of science, the first steps of understanding and learning something are always empirical observation. And we're still very much in that step. And so even though we're trying to develop theories, we're trying to develop models that capture the mechanics of what's going on with earthquake and the various phenomena related to it, we still rely heavily upon empirical data. And so because of that, we have to learn at the pace that Mother Nature is willing to teach us. This is one of the reasons why, it is the main reason why, whenever a significant earthquake happens, engineers go out and reconnoiter the location where the earthquake happened. We investigate, we look for sites of interest. I've participated on several of these missions. Dr. Rollins also has participated on lots of these missions. And the idea is we're going out, we're looking for things that we might be something new, something that we don't understand very well, or cases that may confirm or provide valuable validation for current theories or enhance our understanding. And so because of the fact that we can only learn at the pace that Mother Nature teaches us, it's important that we understand the progression of how we got to where we are today. And learning about these historical earthquakes will help you do this. So when it comes to these historical earthquakes, there's a few things I want you to understand. I have a whole list. The whole rest of this slides, I think, are roughly about 30 historical earthquakes. I expect you to know and to memorize a few things about each one of these different historical earthquakes. I expect you to understand and memorize where the earthquake happened, when it happened, and why it's significant. If you can get those three things, then you're good to go. And so I recommend that you make some flashcards and write down the information and just drill yourself, and over the next few weeks try to memorize these three facts from all of the historical earthquakes that we'll discuss today. Well, now, with regards to where, for instance, you can't just say California, because there's so many earthquakes in California that are significant that it doesn't make any sense. So you need to say the city as well. And the same goes for Japan. You can't just say Japan. So I prefer that you say the city as well as the state or the country, if possible. So with that, let's just jump right in and let's see what we can understand here. We'll see if I can change the color of my pen. I don't like the red. It's too harsh for me. Okay. I love this quote. I can't find who originally said it. The earliest instance or reference I can find was by a guy named George Santayana. But we've all heard it, right? Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so when we learn from our past, when we learn from these earthquakes, then, well, we hopefully can avoid the mistakes that those in the past made. I want you to keep in mind one thing, right? That everything we learned this or will learn this semester has come at a very high price. I firsthand and personally have seen the price that many people pay when an earthquake devastates a region. And I take, this thought very, very seriously, that we benefit from their tragedy. And so I take, it's very sobering when we think about that. So as we approach and look at these historical earthquakes, please keep that in mind and maybe express a little bit of gratitude and reverence for this. And I think it will help you learn the material better as well when you do that. So let's start all the way back in 79 AD. The location, this is kind of famous. You guys may have heard of the city of Pompeii. It's actually two cities. There was Pompeii and another city called Herculaneum, which was located just adjacent to it at the base of Mount Vesuvius near modern-day Naples. Over a period of 16 years, historians at that time noted and recorded that there were a lot of earthquakes. And all of those earthquakes ultimately culminated in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which buried those two cities, and which today, if you go to Pompeii, you can see basically the perfectly restored or perfectly preserved city of Pompeii, because it was buried under ash for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a significant event because this was the first recorded evidence that there is a link between earthquakes and volcanoes. We know today that there's definitely a link. Both mechanisms are caused by movements and movements deep within the earth, within the crust of the earth, and so. But back then, they didn't have that understanding. And so because of that, this was a very significant event for science. Next, we're going to jump forward quite a bit to the year 1556 to the region of Shanxi, China. Jingwen, I hope I pronounced that correctly. You can correct me if not later. This was a very significant event because according to Chinese records, which tend to be very, very accurate, over 800,000 fatalities are estimated to have occurred. Based on the descriptions of the shaking and the damage that ensued, we estimate that the magnitude of the earthquake was at least a 7.9 and probably greater. The shaking extended out more than 500 kilometers from the estimated epicenter of the earthquake, and so it affected a large number of people. And based on modern records, this is arguably the most deadly earthquake ever. I don't think, at least based on our modern records, there's been an earthquake that's produced more fatalities than this one. Most of the fatalities occurred among people who were dwelling in caves. But it was interesting that this earthquake resulted in one of the earliest published recommendations on how to survive an earthquake. And this came from the Chinese philosopher Kincaid, who said, "At the very beginning of an earthquake, people indoors should not go out immediately. Just crouch down and wait. Even if the nest has collapsed, some eggs may remain intact. The next earthquake, we're going to fast forward to the year 1700. And now we're over here in the Americas, the Pacific Northwest, to be more precise. There was an earthquake during the month of January of the year 1700. How in the world do we know this? Well, because we have several evidences that can pinpoint down to the week, if not the day, when this earthquake happened. We have Native American folklore. We have very accurate Japanese records of a massive tsunami that hit the islands. And we also have paleoseismic and dendrochronologic evidence of the event. Dendrochronology is the study of tree rings or ancient tree rings and fossilized trees. And entire forests were leveled on the same day. And we have those fossilized remains today. This was a very large subduction zone earthquake. And the estimated magnitude is anywhere between an 8.7 to a 9.2, and it affected the entire region circled on the right. This is significant because this provides a case history for what we can expect again from the Cascadia subduction zone in this region. And you can see in the region where we're talking that it's a highly populated and a very modern, it's a highly populated region with a very modern infrastructure. And so this is definitely an event of concern for us today. Okay, now we're in the year 1755 in Lisbon, Portugal. There was an earthquake of a magnitude estimated between 8.5 to 9.0. And so this was actually another megathrust offshore subduction zone earthquake. Resulted in significant ground shaking. It produced a tsunami that came into Lisbon, Portugal. And there's an estimated 60,000 total fatalities, 10,000 in Lisbon alone. This was a very significant event because at the time, in 1755, Lisbon was a very happening city, very highly populated. And so, this was a population center. But another thing that is very significant about this event and why it's important is that after the event, the Portuguese Prime Minister ordered the very first known scientific survey of the effects of the earthquake and the hazards that resulted from it. And that scientific survey was basically our first attempt to try to understand earthquakes so that we can improve and make more resistant infrastructure in the future. So this was a very significant move on the part of that Prime Minister. Okay, let's fast forward again to the years 1811 and 1812. Now we're in North America, in the United States, but we're not in California. We're right on the border between Missouri and Arkansas in a region known as the New Madrid region. There were a series of 3 to 4 very large earthquakes, magnitudes ranging between 7.3 to 7.8 is our estimate. All of these earthquakes occurred within a span of about 2 months. We don't know exactly how many fatalities occurred, but we know that some significant effects resulted from these earthquakes. There's reports, for instance, that portions of the Missouri River flowed south to north instead of north to south. And that lasted for a couple of hours before the river corrected itself. Ground shaking was felt as far north as Maine. Certainly in Boston and New York, they reported shaking from these events. And it illustrates the dangers that can occur in the New Madrid seismic zone of the United States. What's interesting is these earthquakes happen to be the largest documented earthquakes that have occurred in the United States. And it's interesting that they didn't occur in California. They occurred here or I'm not here, I'm sorry, they occurred in the central portion of the United States. And so New Madrid seismic zone is a significant area or it's an area of significant seismic risk. And it shows that you do not need to be in California or on the West Coast to live in a dangerous seismic zone. Okay, the next event, 1857. This is in California, Southern California, near the Fort Tejon. This is near Los Angeles, or modern-day Los Angeles today. In this year, 1857, there was a very large earthquake. We don't know the exact magnitude, but we estimate it's probably somewhere between 7.9 to 8.3, around the 8.0 region. This occurred on the San Andreas Fault. And paleoseismic evidence shows that approximately 350 kilometers of the fault ruptured in this event. Because nobody was living down there at the time except a couple of missionary outposts, only 2 recorded fatalities occurred. These were both missionaries near the Fort Tejon when their little missionary settlement, of course, collapsed. The reason why this earthquake is important is because it serves as the case history for what everyone refers to as the big one in Southern California. We haven't seen the big one. We'll talk a little bit later about, for instance, the 1994 Northridge Earthquake. And a lot of people point to that and say, boy, that was a big earthquake. And it was a big earthquake. But it's nothing compared to this one. And this earthquake on the San Andreas Fault in Los Angeles, when it occurs, will be a very significant seismic event, and it's going to produce a lot of damage and a lot of loss. Okay, 1886 is the year. Now we're on the east coast of the United States in the city of Charleston, South Carolina. At this time, Charleston was a popular city. It wasn't very big, but it certainly had a port, and it had a lot of historical significance because Fort Sumter is located in Charleston, which, if any of you are history buffs, will know that that's where essentially the Civil War started. So there was a lot of military presence in Charleston. So this occurred after the Civil War. The earthquake is estimated between a magnitude 6.6 to 7.3. The damage cost from this earthquake is around $6 million, which would be about $150 million in today's money. Why this earthquake was significant is because a few reasons. First of all, again, we have an example of an earthquake in an area that a lot of people don't typically associate with earthquakes. This is the east coast of the United States. It's nowhere near a plate boundary like California is, yet a large earthquake occurred, and it damaged over 2,000 structures in the city. Therefore, this quake represents the largest known quake that's occurred on the east coast of the United States. Another thing that was really interesting from this quake, the soils in Charleston are very, very susceptible to soil liquefaction. And this earthquake liquefied a lot of the soil. A lot of the descriptions of the effects and what was observed from this earthquake point to soil liquefaction. At the time, however, people didn't realize what soil liquefaction was, and so they were just, describing what they saw. But as we read the descriptions today, they definitely point to liquefaction. Okay, now this is kind of a famous earthquake, the 1906 San Francisco, California earthquake. This was on the northern portion of the San Andreas Fault, a very large earthquake, a magnitude estimated between 7.7 to 8.2. there's a lot of interesting things to be aware of about this earthquake. About 475 kilometers of the San Andreas Fault ruptured during this event. And at the time, San Francisco was probably the largest city in the state of California. Its population was booming, its economy was booming. It was the population, the cultural center of California. And so when this earthquake occurred, it was devastating, not only its physical effects, but also in the emotional, the mental, and the economic effects that it had on the city of San Francisco. This earthquake was the first major earthquake to strike a densely populated area in the United States. It had a major impact, and it showcases what happens when lifelines are destroyed because of all of the water lines that were ruptured either from the ground shaking or the liquefaction that occurred in the city. The water pressure was lost, and the firefighters had no way to battle the fires that were ravaging the city at the time. One of the things that's really interesting about this earthquake is it shows kind of the dark side of what can happen with politics and policy. If you look at the records, even today, San Francisco officially claimed that only about 325 fatalities occurred, which almost all scientists and sociologists today agree is completely bogus. We believe the number to be larger than about 3,000, which at that time was enormous, an enormous number of fatalities. Why in the world would San Francisco only report 325 fatalities if more than 3,000 fatalities occurred? Because they didn't want to scare away people who were coming to the city. They had the cultural center in California, and they knew it. They had the economic center in California, and they knew it. And they didn't want to give encouragement for people to go elsewhere. And so they tried to undersell or how bad the earthquake was. But it didn't work. As a result of this earthquake and the damage that occurred, you can see from this picture on the right just how much San Francisco was booming. There were buildings being constructed everywhere, cranes erected everywhere, frames of buildings going up. A lot of that stopped after this earthquake, and they looked for somewhere else to go, and they settled on Los Angeles. And so they went to Southern California instead. At this time, in 1906, the just blossoming Hollywood industry was in San Francisco. And after this earthquake, it picked up and it moved to Southern California instead. A lot of things picked up and moved to Southern California. And to this day, Southern California, specifically Los Angeles, is the heart and cultural center of California. And we have this 1906 earthquake to thank for that. What's ironic is those folks who moved to Los Angeles aren't aware that Los Angeles is sitting on a time bomb as well. And they have yet to see their major earthquake hit the modern infrastructure. Okay, 1923, we're going to jump across the Pacific Ocean to Japan. Specifically, we're going to the city of Kanto, or the region of Kanto, Japan. This was a magnitude 7.9 earthquake, and it killed a total of 105,385. Now you're going to notice, wow, that's really precise. All these other earthquakes we've talked about have just been estimates of fatalities. That's right. It's because the Japanese have always been meticulous record keepers when it comes to these hazards. And we owe a lot of our understanding of earthquakes from them. And so the Japanese are really, really good when it comes to earthquakes, to resilience, to recovering from these earthquakes. And you'll see that in these records and things that they kept. This is known as the Great Kanto Earthquake. If you look in Japanese literature or in the journals, they always refer to it as the Great Kanto Earthquake, and that's because this earthquake changed how Japan looks at earthquakes. 105,000 fatalities is a lot of fatalities. This quake produced a tsunami that caused extensive damage to the cities of Tokyo and Yokohama. And it also shines a light on some of the social ramifications that usually and almost always occur after an earthquake. There has always been a little bit of tension between Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese. Those three different nations over in Asia don't always get along. And at this time in 1923, there was quite a bit of tension. The Japanese essentially blamed the earthquake on the Koreans and the Chinese. And as a result, a massive genocide occurred where the Japanese started hunting and exterminating as many Koreans and Chinese as they could find on the Japanese mainland. And it was a very unfortunate tragedy, but it demonstrates and shows, again, the social ramifications that can happen following a major disaster like this. We don't always think logically after these disasters, and we look for a scapegoat. We look for something, someone to blame, and a lot of people will, fall back on things that don't really make sense. Well, one thing I want to say, I want to go back. One thing I want to say, one more thing about this Kanto earthquake. This earthquake was the initiator for modern day seismic resistant design in the world. It initiated it in Japan, but that work that initiated in Japan was what subsequently kickstarted the modern field of earthquake engineering today. Okay, 1925. Now we're back in the United States, in the city, of Santa Barbara, California. This was a magnitude 6.8 earthquake, and it only had 13 fatalities. It produced $6 million of damage in the currency at the time, which would be about $100 million in damage today. It doesn't sound like a lot, does it? 13 fatalities, a magnitude 6.8, $100 million in damage. Why in the world is this a significant historical earthquake? Well, for a few reasons. First of all, the earthquake caused the liquefaction failure of the Sheffield Dam. And that failure led to a lot of the current design standards and codes that are out there for earth dams today. We as in engineers, also started to observe after this earthquake that structures that were built out of wood and reinforced concrete almost always perform better than unreinforced masonry structures. And as a result of that observation, the very first explicit code provisions for earthquake-resistant design started showing up in the U.S. building codes, where for seismic regions, you started to see wording that said, hey, I think wood construction or reinforced concrete design is better for earthquakes. And so that was a very significant step for us in our earthquake engineering. Fast forward a few years later, about 8 years later, we're still in California, but now the city of Long Beach. This was a magnitude 6.4 event, so smaller, but it had 120 fatalities and approximately $50 million of damage, or $835 million in today's currency. This earthquake occurred in Southern California on the Newport-Inglewood Fault. And why this earthquake is significant is because it caused considerable damage to lots of buildings, but in particular, it caused a lot of damage to school buildings. Most of the 120 fatalities were children. And over 230 schools in the area were severely damaged or collapsed. And as, again, getting back to social ramifications, earthquake damage is always heartbreaking. But when it involves children, that's when legislation, that's when action begins to happen, and usually very rapidly. And in this case, there was no exception. Because of all of the fatalities, the state of California passed what's called the Field Act, which required that all public schools in the state had to be earthquake resistant. And they had to be stronger than your average structure. And it also led to more stringent seismic design requirements for other buildings in general, particularly public buildings. And so to this day, public schools in the state of California have a much higher level of seismic resistance than your other typical structures. And I can vouch for that from personal experience, having worked on and helped design several public schools in the state of California. You just work on a higher level when you're working on those schools. They hold your feet to the fire, and they expect more when you're designing those school buildings. And all of that because of this 1933 Long Beach earthquake. Okay, 1940. We're in Imperial Valley, California. There's a magnitude 7.1 earthquake. Now this is in Southern California, a little bit in the interior. There were 9 fatalities from this event, with a damage cost of $6 million in their currency of the day, $93 million in our modern day currency. It doesn't sound like a lot. There weren't a lot of fatalities, not a ton of economic damage. But this earthquake is significant for one particular reason. This was the very first earthquake event that seismologists captured on paper. This was the first event this was the event where we captured our first accelerogram from what's known as the El Centro station. So this is the El Centro record. It's a very famous earthquake record because it's the first time we captured an earthquake. Since this record was recorded, we have since captured thousands and thousands of earthquake records, which we've used to understand ground motions and to develop ways to predict ground motions. So this record was the first. And because of that, it's kind of a big deal to seismologists and to earthquake engineers today. I think the original record is displayed today in the Smithsonian Museum. I've been told that. I haven't been to the Smithsonian to see, but so I could be wrong, but at least that's what I've been told. This record, by the way, is still used by engineers today in performing earthquake engineering design. Okay, 1959. We're going to go to Montana, specifically the Yellowstone region of Montana. This was a magnitude 7.3 event. It produced 36 fatalities with $11 million in damage. This earthquake occurred near the Yellowstone Park and Hebgen Lake, which if you go up to Yellowstone today, you'll see lots of signs and things commemorating what happened. This earthquake caused a series of seiches, which again are sloshing waves in Hebgen Lake, and these waves lasted for about 12 hours. And they produced significant damage to structures that were located on the shore. Just completely took out structures and pulled them into the lake. A massive landslide occurred, which buried a Boy Scout camp next to the Madison River, and that landslide dammed the Madison River and produced what is called Quake Lake. Quake Lake is still there today. Unfortunately, the scouts who were there at the time were buried, and almost all of the fatalities from this earthquake came from that scout camp. One of the interesting things from this event is that the Hebgen Lake permanently tilted. The earth beneath the lake permanently tilted because of the earthquake, which caused subsidence and caused the water to shift. As a result, the north shore of the lake flooded, and you can go to the lake today and still see submerged homes where you just see the roof and things like that. And if the southern portion of the lake, as you can see from this photograph that I'm circling, the water shifted and moved north, and so there were docks and piers that were completely dry and out of the water after the earthquake. This is significant because we have a similar situation here in Utah, where we have normal faulting, we have a very large lake, and many scientific experts believe that after a large earthquake on the Wasatch Fault, they believe that subsidence could occur, which could result in flooding of the eastern shore of the Great Salt Lake, which could have some very nasty consequences, like burying I-15 underwater, burying portions of Davis and Weber counties underwater. So this could be a big deal. Okay, 1960, Valdivia, Chile. This was a very large subduction zone megathrust earthquake, a magnitude 9.5. This was the largest and most powerful earthquake recorded in modern history. The earthquake was massive. It's unknown how many fatalities occurred, but up to 6,000 are confirmed. The damage cost was estimated between $400 to $800 million, which would be between 2.9 to 5.8 billion dollars in today's currency. This earthquake sent a massive tsunami across the entire Pacific basin. The tsunami impacted Hawaii, it impacted Japan, it impacted other countries located around the Pacific. Of course, the region that was most affected by the tsunami was Chile itself. This earthquake was also so massive that it triggered an enormous volcanic eruption in southern Chile, the Cordon Caulle volcano, about 38 hours after the earthquake occurred. (1964), so just a few years later, we are now in the city of Portage, Alaska. So this is near the Prince William Sound, near Anchorage. Magnitude 9.2 megathrust subduction zone earthquake just south of Alaska. This earthquake produced 131 fatalities with $311 million in damage, which would be about $2.2 billion in today's currency. This was the second largest earthquake to ever be recorded in modern history, and it's the largest earthquake that was ever recorded in North America. Extensive liquefaction and landsliding occurred around Anchorage and around the coastlines there in southern Alaska. Shaking and underwater landslides produce tsunamis, as well as just these mega waves, which tend to be localized within the local bays there. But these waves, with these little localized waves from underwater landslides, can produce waves that are like 100 to 200 feet in height, which just remarkable and very deadly phenomena because of these earthquakes. Entire portions of the city of Anchorage just slid out into the ocean. For instance, you see the headscarp here of one of those landslides along 4th Avenue in downtown Anchorage. In that same year, 1964, in the city of Niigata, Japan, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake occurred, producing 36 fatalities. A total of 3,534 structures collapsed, but over 11,000 more structures were significantly damaged. This earthquake was significant because of the liquefaction that it produced. Niigata is an area that has very susceptible soils to liquefaction, and there were enormous ground deformations and failing structures as a result. If you look at the cover of your textbook and those buildings that tipped over, those were from the 1964 Niigata earthquake. Scientists looked at that and said, okay, something's going on here. We don't understand it. They just had explored a few months earlier the damage up in Alaska from that 1964 quake there. And now this earthquake, they saw many of the same ground deformations and phenomena and said, there's something happening here that we don't understand. And these two events, the 1964 Alaska and the 1964 Niigata earthquake, were the two events that opened the door on modern day research for liquefaction. And much of what we now understand about soil liquefaction was learned from these two events and from the subsequent laboratory and field experiments that came following these events. In 1971, San Fernando, California. This was a magnitude 6.6 earthquake that produced 65 fatalities and $505 million in damage. This earthquake nearly resulted in the collapse of the lower San Fernando Dam. The dam experienced liquefaction on its interior and collapsed inwards. So there was a landslide that went into the dam. Fortunately, if you look at the water level is pretty low. It was a very low water year, a drought year. And as a result, there wasn't a massive failure of the dam. But those who investigated the dam said, if we were to draw a cross-section, if this is the water and this is the dam from the failed section, they say that there was only about 2 to 3 feet of freeboard. Had the water breached the top of the dam, it would have rapidly eroded the dam and the entire dam would have broken. Just downstream of the dam, you could see it right here, is the little town of San Fernando, California, which has a significant population. And that would have resulted in probably thousands and thousands of fatalities and countless dollars of damage. You could believe what you want. I personally believe that was a tender mercy from our Heavenly Father who prevented that disaster from happening, but allowed us to learn from it. As a result of this failure, many modern day standards regarding dam safety were implemented, including the Dam Safety Act in California, which to this day, designing a dam, an earthen dam in the state of California, is almost an impossible task because of the tremendous safety requirements that are associated with it. This earthquake also brought down several important bridges and a hospital in the town of San Fernando, which resulted in a complete overhaul of the reinforced concrete building codes in the United States. Many of our modern day reinforced concrete codes that you learn about, for instance, in your reinforced concrete design class, they came from this earthquake. And so we definitely learned a lot about reinforced concrete here. And finally, many of the strong ground motions that were obtained from this event we still use today for seismic design. Okay, 1983. We're now in the state of Idaho, specifically a location called Bora Peak. This was a massive 7.3 earthquake that occurred on a normal fault. It ruptured approximately 34 kilometers along the fault and produced about $12.5 million of damage. This was a very lowly population area. Only 2 fatalities were reported. But this is a significant event because of the type of fault it was and where it was recorded. This is the largest earthquake that was recorded in modern history in what's called the Intermountain Seismic Belt. This is the geologic region where we currently live, and it's an area distinguished by normal faulting. And so, oops, that's not the one I want. Here's my whiteboard. I'm going to take a cross section across California, Nevada, Utah, and into Colorado. So here we have Nevada and Utah. Here we have California. These are the Sierra Nevada mountains. These are the Wasatch Mountains and the Rockies. And so I'm looking north across this cross section here. And what's happening geologically is we have extension going on. And when we have extension, the ground's trying to spread. And the only way that it can do that is we have a whole series of faults that go like this across the Sierra Nevadas and across the Wasatch Range. This whole region is, like I said, it's called the Intermountain Seismic Belt, or we call it sometimes the ISB. And what you have in the Intermountain Seismic Belt, if you look at Google Earth or look at any map, you're going to see a whole bunch of mountain ranges that trend north to south with valleys in between. And what happens is when you get stretching or extension, this slab of soil in the valley moves downward. That's called a graben. The mountain ranges stay put, but you get the valleys that start sliding. And so these faults are called normal faults because they're extensional. And we'll talk more about those in a couple of days. But so this is kind of what it looks like in the Intermountain Seismic Belt. And that's what affected this earthquake in Bora Peak. And the reason it's significant is because it's kind of the prototype or the case history of the type and size of earthquake that we could expect for a major earthquake here in Utah, like along the Wasatch Fault. And so, an earthquake this size could produce some extraordinary damage in a highly populated area. Okay, 1985, Mexico City, Mexico. This was an earthquake of a magnitude 8.0 to 8.3. Over 10,000 fatalities were recorded with an estimated damage cost between $3 to $4 billion, which would be $6 to $8 billion in today's currency. This was an intraplate subduction zone event that occurred about 350 kilometers away from Mexico City. 350 kilometers, folks. That's a long ways away. But what happened was remarkable, and the reason why this earthquake is significant is because it teaches us a whole lot about a phenomenon that we'll learn about this semester called site response. It was interesting from this earthquake. Now you got to understand that Mexico City just sits on this old lake bed deposit of soft soils. So you have all these buildings constructed in this big valley. And as the ground motions would come into this soft soil, these were small ground motions, because the earthquake occurred 350 kilometers away. But the interesting thing is those ground motions got into this soft soil, and the frequency of the soil matched with the frequency of the ground motions, and they amplified them to the point that when they came through the soft soils and they got up to the top, structures that had a frequency that matched the frequency of these ground motions coming up through the soil got shaken crazy hard. And so structures that were between about 6 to 15 stories high just started rocking back and forth like crazy. Structures that were shorter hardly moved at all. Structures that were taller, they wiggled a little bit, but there was no damage. But structures between 6 to 15 stories were tipping over, were crashing into each other, and caused a lot of damage. Guess what types of structures tend to be between 6 and 15 stories tall? That's right, residential apartment buildings. And as a result of this, there were a lot of fatalities. And so this earthquake opened the door to research on this subject of site response, of how soils can amplify or de-amplify ground motions that are coming into them. And a lot of the research and things that we've learned about site response and soil amplification, we learned from this earthquake. That brings us to 1989, Loma, Prieta, California, magnitude 6.9 earthquake with 63 fatalities and $6 billion in damage. This was the famous World Series earthquake that occurred in October when we had the Giants playing who's the other Bay Area team? The Athletics, the Oakland A's. So it was the Bay Area World Series. Everyone was watching, the world was watching, and then this earthquake occurred. It stopped the game. They delayed the game because of the earthquake. This occurred on a portion of the San Andreas Fault, but for the San Andreas, it's a relatively small earthquake, but it produced a lot of damage. Why this earthquake was important is for a few reasons. First, it produced a significant amount of liquefaction in the Bay Area. And we learned a lot about liquefaction from this earthquake. It also highlighted the phenomenon of site response. So you'll recall from our lecture on Monday that I recorded the difference between Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island, the difference in the ground motions that were recorded. That, again, is an example of site response. And there were lots of recording stations in the area that captured this earthquake, and we could see firsthand how site response was affecting the ground motions observed at the ground surface. And so a lot of research was initiated following this earthquake to try to understand what happened. Okay, 1994, Northridge, California. This is Southern California. A magnitude 6.7 event with 61 fatalities, between $13 and $20 billion in earthquake damage. This was a very strong earthquake that occurred within Los Angeles on the previously undiscovered Northridge blind thrust fault. The reason they call it a blind thrust fault is here's the ground surface. You have some faults that are in a compressional regime that are very, very shallow, where you might only have like 5 degrees, maybe 10 degrees at most. And as a result, when an earthquake occurs, this thrust fault will come up just a little bit like that. And you can imagine that that little lip that forms because of the thrust fault, it erodes very, very quickly. And so then you end up with just a ground surface that looks like that maybe. So they're very difficult to spot to the untrained eye. And so some of these faults, however, like a blind fault, the fault only comes up that far. And then there's soil on top of it. And so there is no exposed fault surface, and that's why we call it a blind fault, because the fault itself is under the ground. We can't see it. And blind faults can be very dangerous because we can't see them. We don't know where they are until they actually produce an earthquake. This event was very significant because it produced enormous accelerations. Peak ground accelerations in excess of 1 Gs were recorded in the area. So, folks, you got to remember, right? Horizontal accelerations in excess of 1 G, that basically means if I take Newton's law of force equals mass times acceleration, we're applying a horizontal force temporarily to our structures that are equal to, if not exceeding, their vertical weight. And so that can produce enormous damage to structures. And of course, as a result, lots of structures were knocked over. This earthquake produced some significant provisions or revisions of seismic design codes, particularly involving codes involving steel and wood design. At the time, there was a very popular trend in the architecture in California having what are called soft stories. So these are stories where if you walk into like a hotel and you have a really high ceiling on that first floor, that's what's called a soft story. What tends to happen when you have those really high ceilings on the first floor is you just create basically a point of weakness in your structure, and that's where a lot of structures were tipping over. And so the design of those soft stories became a lot more stringent following this earthquake. Okay, back to Japan, 1995, Kobe, Japan. This was a 6.9 earthquake that produced 5,502 fatalities. This was a strong strike-slip earthquake that occurred about 20 kilometers away. But what's interesting about this earthquake, if this is the city of Kobe, this pathetic-looking star thingy, and the fault came in like this. The earthquake started like here and started rupturing down the fault. And we're going to learn a little bit about this idea of directivity with fault rupture. But what essentially happens is the earthquake gains momentum as it starts rupturing down the fault. And then it's almost like a loaded gun. Once it reaches the end of the fault, it just flings its energy out into Kobe, and Kobe was right in its path. And so we learned a lot about the effects of directivity from this event. So that even though it was a magnitude 6.9, the energy that was directed at the city of Kobe was massive. Now this earthquake resulted in about 102 billion with a B dollars of damage. And a lot of that occurred because of the port facilities that were damaged due to shaking and liquefaction, like you can see in this picture here. The port facilities were devastated, and the ports in the city of Kobe were its largest economic provider. In fact, the port in Kobe at the time was probably one of the largest ports in the entire country of Japan, and a ton of commerce went through that port. As a result of these broken port facilities, the shipping companies had to go somewhere else. So they looked for different ports to go into Japan. And Kobe scrambled to try to repair these port facilities. However, it was a slow process. Once they repaired the ports, as you might expect, a lot of the shipping companies did not come back. They just stayed at the ports that they were at. And so, I mean, in a way, Kobe is still accruing losses from this earthquake, even though it's more than 20 years later. Before the year 2011, this earthquake was officially the most expensive natural disaster in the world. That was a tremendous amount of money and cost that the Japanese people needed to pay. But then in 2011, the Tohoku earthquake, which we'll talk about in a minute, occurred, and the costs associated with that earthquake dwarfed the damage costs from the Kobe earthquake. By the way, here's some food for thought. A port facility is a major lifeblood of any country's economy. We have port facilities located throughout the United States, but perhaps the largest port in our country is the Long Beach port, the Port of Long Beach in Los Angeles. A BYU alumnus is the director of that port, and he's spoken at BYU several times. He's indicated that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of all products and commerce that comes in the United States comes in through the Port of Long Beach. Could you imagine what would happen to our economy if this happened to the Port of Long Beach? It's humbling and very sobering to think about. And this is why we do what we do as earthquake engineers. 1999 in Izmit, Turkey. This was a massive 7.6 strike-slip earthquake that killed between 17 and 35,000 people. We don't have an exact tally, just unofficial records. The damage estimates were between $3 to $6.5 billion. This was a very well-instrumented earthquake that seismologists predicted would occur. At the time, the seismologists were predicting that there would be a very large earthquake that would occur in that area before the year 2026, and they were right. Another thing that's interesting about this earthquake is that it shows that new construction is not always better construction. Just have a look at this photo on the right. You have this ancient mosque that I'm highlighting here that's been there for a very, very long time, surrounded by modern infrastructure, modern apartment buildings and such. Look what's fallen down. It's not the old mosque. It's the new construction that fell down. And what we learned from this is that the quality of construction, contractors cutting corners, trying to save costs, can have enormous implications on the safety and the performance of structures during earthquakes. You can bet that this mosque, when it was constructed to a very high standard and with careful care. And so we've seen this around the world, that there's lots of ancient structures that seem to perform very well, but modern day infrastructure, not so much. Okay, we're almost getting to the end, folks. 1999, Taiwan, the city of Chi-Chi, a magnitude 7.6, 2,415 fatalities with $10 billion of estimated damage. This was a significant earthquake because Taiwan is a very modern infrastructure with very updated and technologies. And this earthquake definitely impacted that infrastructure. At the time, this is arguably the best recorded large earthquake prior to 2011, and we gained a lot of ground motions from this, from which we've learned a lot about predicting ground motions, as well as how those ground motions can produce subsequent hazards. 2004, California, the city of Parkfield. It's a magnitude 6.0 earthquake with 0 fatalities and negligible damage costs. So why in the world am I including this in our list of significant historical earthquakes? Because the story behind this earthquake is fascinating. Parkfield had, prior to this earthquake, Parkfield had experienced a major earthquake about every 22 years, almost to the day, between the years 1857 and 1966. You can look at the plot here on the right. As a result of this, scientists observed and said, holy cow, this could be a tremendous opportunity for us to instrument the site, to gain understanding about ground motions, because what was happening was there was an earthquake scheduled to occur in the year 1993, according to this plot, as you can see. And so researchers, scientists got a ton of funding, and they went and they instrumented the dickens out of Parkfield. And they waited. And they waited. And they waited. 1993 came and passed, nothing. 1996 came and passed, nothing. 1999 came and passed, nothing. Unfortunately, a lot of the funding expired and they just didn't renew it. A lot of the instruments got pulled out of the ground. But the earthquake finally came in the year 2004. And there were still several instruments in the area, and as a result, we collected a lot of valuable data. And we should be able to understand a lot more about ground motions because of this event. 2004, Sumatra, Indonesia. This was a megathrust subduction zone earthquake that occurred on Boxing Day. That's December 26th. This was a 9.1 to 9.3 magnitude event. It resulted in about $15 billion of damage, which isn't a ton, and based on some of the other earthquakes we've seen, but it produced over 230,000 fatalities. Most of those fatalities were a result of the massive tsunami that ensued from the earthquake. Now, it occurred in a time when social media was just getting off the ground, and as a result, the effects in the video from this earthquake and the tsunami just flooded the internet to a point where a tsunami has now become a cultural phenomenon. And whenever an earthquake occurs, everyone wants to know, is there going to be a tsunami, no matter how small the earthquake is? The media covered this event extensively, and it really shined a light on the damage that can occur from large earthquakes and from tsunamis. As a result of this earthquake, research funding for tsunamis took off, and to this day continues to be a highly funded hazard in the area of earthquake engineering. I want to point out one thing that's interesting. Despite the size of this earthquake, despite the fatalities, the damage cost in dollars was low. This demonstrates that there is not necessarily a correlation between the size of the earthquake and the cost of an earthquake, or the cost of the damage of an earthquake. 2010, Port-au-Prince, Haiti. This was a magnitude 7.0 earthquake that occurred in a Caribbean nation in a place we don't expect earthquakes to happen. The damage was between $7.2 to $13 billion, and it resulted in likely 50,000 casualties. But this is an example, again, another social science example, the opposite of San Francisco. Haiti reports over 316,000 fatalities, which most social scientists and engineers today say no way. 50,000 tops. Why in the world would Haiti report and inflate the number of fatalities? Well, because Haiti wants more welfare assistance. It figured by inflating the number of casualties, it would get more money from other countries to help rebuild. Really what's significant about this earthquake is the impact it's had on the social sciences associated with earthquakes. Few structures in the area were engineered. Most were damaged, most collapsed, most lifelines were destroyed, and even though you had a poverty-stricken area, it became even more poor and more of a poor place to live. A massive cholera epidemic ensued, and it really showcases what can happen when you have corrupt leaders that are trying to lead reconstruction efforts. Most of the funding that was given to Haiti to reconstruct never made its way to the reconstruction efforts. They got funneled off into pockets of leaders and politicians, and it really is a tragedy. Okay, 2010, 2011, New Zealand, the city of Christchurch. These were a series of about 4 earthquakes that occurred within about a year, between September 2010 and December-ish of 2011. These were large earthquakes that varied between magnitudes of 5.9 to 7.1. It resulted in about 182 fatalities in the city. Losses exceeded $27 billion. I've been to Christchurch, and I can tell you that the damage from this earthquake, the impact from these earthquakes is extensive. Take a moment and go look at Google Earth. Look at the city of Christchurch and look at a date prior to September 2010, and then fast forward the satellite image date to a later date, maybe something in 2012 or 2013. Look at how much Christchurch has changed. My estimate is between 30 to 40% of the structures are probably gone, collapsed, or went away. The thing that's interesting is it was not the ground motions that damaged these structures. It was the liquefaction. The damage from liquefaction critically damaged these structures, not to the point that they collapsed and killed a ton of people, but to the point where they couldn't be used and they had to be demolished and knocked down. As a result, this Christchurch earthquake has become arguably the most important and significant case study for soil liquefaction in history. And we are just beginning to learn the secrets of liquefaction that these earthquakes are revealing right now. The National Science Foundation is funding millions and millions and millions of dollars in liquefaction research based in Christchurch. Other things that were important about this earthquake, it's an interesting case history for the insurance industry. Most of the commercial structures in Christchurch were insured, and they were fine. But one of the most significant losses from this earthquake were the residential structures, which probably exceeded $4 billion in total losses. Those structures were not insured for liquefaction damage. And if you look in our modern building codes today, we do not have procedures or specifications to design residential structures for liquefaction damage. Maybe we should rethink that based on what we saw from this earthquake. This earthquake is also significant because it shows what happens when you have multiple loadings on a damaged structure. These structures were hit by earthquake after earthquake after earthquake, and we could observe firsthand how these structures degraded with each additional earthquake. 2011, the Tohoku, Japan earthquake, a magnitude 9.0, killed an estimated 20,000 people. The reason this isn't a precise estimate is they're still counting, I believe. The damage cost associated with this earthquake is estimated to be over $235 billion and could possibly exceed $300 billion. This was a megathrust earthquake off the eastern shore of Japan, and it was the largest earthquake in Japan's known or recorded history. This is significant because the largest earthquake that engineers and seismologists believed was possible from this subduction zone source was about a magnitude 8.8. That was their worst case scenario. And Mother Nature humbled us and showed us that a 9.0 magnitude earthquake was possible. This earthquake produced a massive tsunami that slammed into Japan and took out the nuclear reactor in Fukushima. Most of you will probably remember this. Most of the Japanese structures performed very well to the ground motions. Very little damage or collapse was reported because of the ground shaking. But again, the tsunami is what took out most of the infrastructure, killed most of the people, and caused most of the damage. This event was arguably, well, not arguably, it was the most recorded earthquake event in history. And it single-handedly doubled, if not tripled, the number of ground motion recordings we had. It's exciting because we didn't have a lot of recordings of subduction zone events before this earthquake. Now we have a ton. And so we're just barely beginning to learn and benefit and understand subduction zone ground motions from the ground motions resulting from this earthquake. It's likely that what we learn from this earthquake are going to significantly advance the field of earthquake engineering, and we're going to improve a lot. The unfortunate thing is that the Japanese have a culture of not necessarily sharing their data readily, and they tend to sit on their data. As a result, the data from this earthquake is trickling out very, very slowly. And so we're not learning from this earthquake as fast as we could be, but we will eventually get there. All right, folks, that's the end of the presentation. I know this has been a long lecture and a long presentation. Hopefully you took some breaks throughout. Again, I want to emphasize, make some flashcards for each of these events, record where, when, and why. Those are the things that you will be accountable for the first midterm exam. They don't need to be very, very wordy. I know I tend to be pretty wordy when I talk about these different events. You don't need to be wordy if you just summarize in a concise way why the events were significant. You'll be fine. So again, I hope you take some time to learn a little bit about these earthquakes, appreciate the history where our field of earthquake engineering has come from and how far we've come. And we'll continue to move forward and learn from earthquakes that continue to occur in the world today. Have a wonderful day, folks, and I will hopefully see you next week and look forward to giving you your next lecture on Friday. Take care.